The outbreak of war on September 1st, 1939, dismantled the institutions of the Second Polish Republic and created overlapping occupation regimes that reshaped public order. In the west and north, parts of Poland were annexed to the Reich. In the center, a new administrative unit, the General Government, was proclaimed on 12 October 1939 under Governor-General Hans Frank. In the east, the USSR occupied territories pursuant to the German-Soviet Pact of 23 August 1939, integrating them into Soviet republics. Each zone introduced distinct legal codes, police hierarchies, and security expectations. The pre-war Polish State Police, a nationwide force established in 1919 with several tens of thousands of officers distributed across voivodeships, effectively ceased to function once the army capitulated on October 6, 1939. Many policemen were taken prisoner, demobilized, or returned to their localities awaiting instructions that never arrived. Urban residents faced new decrees regulating movement, property, and identity papers. Rural communities encountered requisitions and gendarmerie patrols. Minorities, particularly Jewish communities, were subjected to registration orders and forced labor. Under German rule, the security system combined centralized direction with local auxiliaries. The Ordnungspolizei incorporated Schutzpolizei in larger cities, gendarmerie in rural districts, and criminal police alongside Gestapo offices. In the general government, the higher SS and police leader, first Friedrich Wilhelm Krüger and later Wilhelm Kolpe, coordinated German formations with administrative authorities. Within weeks of the occupation, German commanders ordered former Polish policemen to report for duty. The new formation, officially the Polnische Polizei im Generalgouvernement and colloquially called the Blue Police from the retained dark blue uniforms, was placed under German command structures. Service offered a legal status, a salary denominated in zloty, and ration entitlements. Refusal risked imprisonment. Recruitment drew primarily from pre-war professionals with local knowledge, supplemented by younger men meeting physical and literacy requirements. Training was brief, oriented to patrol procedures, firearms handling, and obedience to German orders. The institution emerged amid other auxiliary bodies. City administrations organized municipal guards. Jewish communities, under Judenrat oversight, formed Jewish order service units in ghettos. Railway authorities kept their own security detachments. The Blue Police operated beyond those special jurisdictions, patrolling streets, escorting prisoners, and manning checkpoints. German commanders tasked them with enforcing curfews, combating petty crime, regulating markets, and assisting in population registrations. In rural counties, they accompanied gendarmerie on identity checks and grain inspections. Their armament, typically pistols and carbines, was adequate for patrol work, but limited against armed groups. German directives, issued through county police chiefs, specified reporting protocols and the requirement to deliver detainees to German stations for interrogation. Public sentiment toward the force was not uniform. Some Polish civilians viewed the reactivation of local policemen as a pragmatic restoration of basic order in towns where looting, smuggling, and disputes over requisitioned property had become daily problems. Others interpreted any cooperation with the occupier as unacceptable. The underground state, which began forming in late 1939 and consolidated under the Union for Armed Struggle and later the Home Army, monitored the new police closely. Underground reports assessed individual officers for reliability, noting family situations, debts, and pre-war records with the aim of gauging susceptibility to pressure. German authorities evaluated the same personnel for compliance, recording missed patrols, delayed reports, or signs of contact with clandestine organizations. Legal frameworks set the boundaries within which the Blue Police operated and civilians responded. German decrees in the general government introduced severe penalties for possession of weapons, unauthorized slaughter of livestock, and black market trading. From the autumn of 1941, Frank's ordinances imposed the death penalty on Jews who left designated districts and on non-Jews who knowingly provided shelter. These were German laws enforced under German supervision. Nonetheless, local auxiliaries often stood at the first procedural step, spotting, stopping, and transferring suspects. In parallel, Soviet security forces in the Eastern Territories from 1939 to 1941 pursued their own policing priorities: nationalization, arrests of perceived political opponents, and deportations, which shaped popular expectations about what police meant under occupation. When German armies advanced east in June 1941 and extended the general government's reach into newly occupied districts, the experience of two different police states framed how communities interpreted any uniform at a doorway. Intelligence estimates and administrative correspondence from late 1939 into 1940 showed German concern about manpower economy. German police units were spread across a large territory, with limited German personnel available for routine work. A locally staffed force promised language skills and familiarity with neighborhoods, roads, and markets. For many former Polish policemen, rejoining provided steady pay for families in a collapsed economy and some leverage in dealing with German officials at the local level. Yet the chain of command was unambiguous. Orders flowed from German district police chiefs, and disciplinary authority rested with German officers. Dismissals, transfers, and arrests for insubordination were recorded alongside promotions for efficient paperwork or timely arrests. The economic context reinforced these dynamics. Price controls, ration cards, and requisitions created incentives for smuggling and illicit trade, especially in food and fuel. Market policing became a daily activity, measurable in confiscation statistics and court dockets. Rail hubs, Krakow, Radom, Lublin, Warsaw, saw intensified checks because transport bottlenecks influenced supplies to German garrisons and local populations. Blue police duty rosters mapped onto these priorities. Market days required additional patrols. Harvest season brought field inspections. Holidays prompted curfew enforcement. German files emphasize quantitative targets: number of inspections, arrests, and reports, while underground observers tracked which officers warned neighbors before raids or looked away during searches. By the end of 1940, the basic contours of the formation were set. A locally recruited police under German control, tasked with routine order maintenance and often the visible face of occupation in streets and villages. Its members carried pre-war professional identities into a new hierarchy. The communities they patrolled judged them through a mixture of necessity, resentment, and case-by-case memory. German authorities measured their utility in numbers of checks and delivered detainees. The underground measured them in names placed on lists of trustworthy, neutral, or dangerous. These preconditions, administrative design, legal severity, economic scarcity, and layered expectations defined the gray zone in which the Blue Police would operate as the occupation deepened. The opening phase began with orders cascading from German district headquarters in October and November 1939 to reassemble former Polish state police personnel under new authority. County notices instructed policemen to report to designated stations, bring pre-war service books, and submit to screening by German officers from the Ordnungspolizei. Oath formulas referenced obedience to German commands and observance of general government decrees. Command structure settled into a layered system. At the top, the higher SS and police leader in Krakow. Below him, regional police commanders in Krakow, Warsaw, Radom, and Lublin, then county chiefs supervising town stations and rural posts. Blue police ranks mirrored pre-war designations: constable, senior constable, sergeant, while German supervisors retained power over promotions and discipline. By the first quarter of 1940, rosters in major cities listed several hundred men per district. In smaller counties, the typical station comprised a dozen to several dozen policemen rotating foot patrols and checkpoint duty. Initial tasks concentrated on visibility and paperwork. Patrols enforced curfew hours, verified Kennkarten, and escorted arrestees to German facilities. Station logs recorded market inspections, seizure of untaxed goods, and referrals to German courts. In Warsaw, Krakow, and Lublin, mixed patrols paired a German NCO with 2 blue policemen for street checks. In rural districts, German gendarmerie summoned local units to accompany searches for unregistered grain and livestock. Traffic control at rail crossings and bridges received priority because transport congestion undermined German supply schedules. Regulations required written daily summaries. Numbers of persons checked, documents confiscated, and goods seized. These metrics shaped deployment patterns, with commanders concentrating shifts on known trading corridors and station squares. Key actors emerged on both sides of the occupation line. On the German side, county police chiefs coordinated with civilian Starost offices to align policing with requisitions, forced labor quotas, and housing controls. In larger cities, Schutzpolizei precincts dictated beat maps and checkpoint locations. On the Polish side, the underground developed liaison cells to assess which stations or individuals could be approached for information or discreet assistance. Reports from late 1939 into early 1940 describe specific officers warning neighborhood committees about impending sweeps or directing residents away from high-risk streets during curfew. Other entries describe arrests conducted precisely on German instruction, with detailed inventories and on-time delivery of detainees. The early pattern was uneven and local. Administrative decrees framed these first months. Identification requirements introduced in late 1939 expanded in early 1940 to include residence registrations and work assignments. Confiscation rules defined what counted as contraband meat or fuel, allowing patrols to detain carriers without a transport voucher. For Jewish residents, city authorities ordered ghettoization on different timetables. Lodz in early 1940, Warsaw by October-November 1940. In each case, local police participated in cordon duties at gates, escorted work details, and enforced movement restrictions. German written orders emphasized that detention decisions and interrogations remained German prerogatives. Blue police were to secure and deliver. Station logs show that a large share of arrests in this period concerned document irregularities, curfew violations, and black market transport rather than armed activity, which was still in its infancy. Material conditions influenced behavior. Pay scales set in zloty combined base salary, with ration entitlements, footwear issue, and occasional fuel allowances for bicycle or horse patrols. Equipment lists typically included a pistol or carbine, handcuffs, a whistle, and standardized forms. Ammunition allotments were limited. Some stations logged quarterly requests citing increased night patrols. Training blocks, delivered by German instructors, lasted days to a few weeks and covered firearms safety, German arrest protocols, and report writing in prescribed templates. Instruction also included briefings on new capital penalties for weapon possession and for providing shelter to persons outside authorized zones, with explicit directives on how to record seizures and witnesses. Civilians adapted to the new routines. Shopkeepers learned inspection schedules and requirements for displaying ration conversion tallies. Commuters carried documents along known checkpoint routes, sometimes shifting to side streets when mixed patrols were seen ahead. Farmers calculated the risks of transporting surplus grain and adjusted delivery times to avoid market inspections. Urban households faced apartment checks for unauthorized lodgers. Stations logged resident counts and referred disputes to German civil offices. Rumors about impending labor roundups spread quickly. In some towns, blue police patrols were seen managing queues at recruitment points. In others, they were observed standing aside while German detachments handled the process directly. The boundary between presence and initiative remained a central feature. Visibility was routine. Decision authority remained German. Relations with other auxiliary forces were clarified in practice. Jewish order service units operated inside designated districts, reporting to local administration and Judenrat. Blue police stood outside gates, carried messages, and escorted work parties to factories or construction sites. Railway guards secured station platforms and cargo sheds. Mixed patrols responded when theft reports involved wider neighborhoods. Municipal guards addressed sanitation codes and minor infractions. When arrests were required, blue police provided the legal form and custody transfer to German precincts. These functional boundaries reduced overlap, but did not eliminate joint actions. Notable operations, such as house-by-house registration drives, involved multi-agency teams with German leadership and local auxiliaries assigned specific roles. The Underground's early assessments focused on personnel mapping. Records identify stations by reliability categories, noting which sergeants permitted discreet warnings and which adhered strictly to German timelines. These assessments did not automatically translate into sabotage or resistance. Rather, they established a baseline for later use. In parallel, German supervisors compiled performance tables, stations ranked by arrests, contraband seizures, and on-time reporting. Men with prior state police investigative experience were pulled into criminal sections assisting German Kripo with burglary and forgery cases, continuing a thread of ordinary policing amid occupation demands. By mid-1940, the opening phase had produced a rhythm. Patrols, paperwork, checkpoints, and periodic concentrated actions tied to decrees about identification, housing, and labor. The visible outcome was an apparent restoration of order in streets and markets measured in quantitative returns. The less visible outcome was the consolidation of a structure through which German authorities could project power using local intermediaries. In this environment, individual choices and station customs began to matter. Whether a patrol lingered an extra minute to allow a passerby to turn, whether a desk sergeant filed an incomplete address that delayed an arrest, whether a county chief pressed for higher seizure numbers to meet German expectations. These patterns, established in the first months, defined the operating habits that would later intersect with harsher policies and escalating underground activity. Strategic aims for the German authorities combined manpower economy with layered control of territory, people, and resources. In the general government, police planners sought to replace permanent German street presence with a mixed system. German command and investigative capacity at district and county level, local patrol execution by the Blue Police, and specialized German units for focused operations. Written targets quantified order maintenance and standardized returns, number of identity checks per shift, seizures of untaxed food, arrests for document violations, referrals to German courts, and escorts delivered on schedule. Economic priorities fed directly into policing plans. Grain deliveries, fuel allocations, and labor quotas were mapped onto patrol routes, checkpoint locations, and raid timetables. For Jewish districts, projected gate staffing and escort rosters were added to duty cycles. The objective was to turn routine interactions, papers, queues, market inspections, into predictable channels that supported requisition and labor policies while reserving German personnel for intelligence and security tasks. Manpower calculations reflected these aims. German police strength in the general government was finite and concentrated in hubs. To extend coverage, county plans assumed local saturation. By early 1940, internal memoranda set target figures that brought the Blue Police to roughly 5 to 6 squads per county, scaling up in larger cities. Aggregate strengths in 1940 hovered around 10,000 to 12,000 men, with plans to expand as training courses graduated new intakes. Later, wartime peaks approached 16,000 as districts added posts. Distribution favored transport nodes. Warsaw, Krakow, Radom, Lublin, and important rail towns received larger complements. Equipment lists emphasized light weapons and mobility by foot or bicycle. Radios were rare at station level. Telephones connected precincts to German headquarters, with runners used during outages. The planning consequence was a reliance on fixed-hour patrols, habitual checkpoint sites, and written reports delivered by set deadlines. Doctrine drew on Ordnungspolizei practice developed in interwar Germany: area responsibility, visible patrolling, and statistical accountability. German supervisors expected local officers to know the alleys, market rhythms, and family networks that generated information. Training syllabi allocated hours to report writing in prescribed forms, arrest and search procedures under German decrees, and coordination with railway guards. In parallel, criminal sections built case files on theft, forgery, and burglary to maintain a baseline of conventional policing. The administrative logic treated ordinary crime and occupation duties as mutually reinforcing. A shopkeeper who relied on station help after a burglary was more likely to comply during inspections and to provide tips on unauthorized slaughter or fuel trade. The underground framed goals in different terms. Intelligence branches within the Polish clandestine state sought to map every station, roster names, shift patterns, typical partners on mixed patrols, and the personal circumstances that might open channels for information or discreet leniency. The strategic intent was not immediate confrontation, but future leverage. Who might pass a warning about an impending sweep? Who could misfile an address? Who would accept a message for a family member? In major cities, underground planning reserved sabotage and targeted actions for later phases. Early priorities focused on preserving networks, documenting decrees, and establishing courier routes that avoided routine checkpoints. Instructions circulated in clandestine bulletins advised civilians to carry documents, learn local patrol routes, and minimize engagement while noting names and habits for future reporting. Preparations on both sides were bureaucratic as much as operational. German district offices produced maps with colored overlays, food depots, factories, warehouses, and crowded residential blocks to guide patrol density. Rotation tables matched market days to reinforced shifts. County gendarmerie requested blue police support for harvest inspections and winter fuel checks, with allocation letters specifying numbers and hours. Stations created card indexes of residents by building an apartment. When ordered, they could deliver household lists to German administrators managing housing compression. For Jewish districts, gate protocols standardized pass issuance and escort departure times for work details, with responsibility lines separating inside and outside jurisdictions. Miscalculations began to appear in the gap between plans and practice. Statistical targets treated checks and seizures as interchangeable across space, but information quality and community reactions differed by neighborhood. Concentrating patrols where returns were high sometimes displaced illicit trade to less visible routes without reducing volume. Reliance on fixed checkpoints facilitated civilian adaptation. Commuters and traders learned predictable schedules. Limited communications meant that patrols encountering an evolving situation, unauthorized gathering, rumor of a sweep, often defaulted to holding actions or withdrawal until German supervisors arrived, undercutting assumptions of decisive local response. On the underground side, early confidence that sympathetic officers could be quickly converted into covert assets underestimated personal risk calculations and the constant German monitoring of station fraternization. Propaganda and public messaging formed the soft arm of planning. German-controlled newspapers and posted notices presented the reactivated local police as a guarantee of calm and an instrument against thieves and speculators. Photographs of uniformed men directing traffic or assisting after accidents accompanied ration announcements and labor regulations. Underground publications answered with cautions. Treat uniforms as instruments of German power. Use knowledge of routines to avoid detection, and distinguish individual behavior from structure when reporting names. This dueling guidance produced a civilian stance that combined compliance with paperwork and observation of patterns, neither open defiance nor full trust. Supply and administrative lines reinforced the system's stability. Pay, rations, and clothing for the Blue Police moved through German-controlled county budgets, tying station performance to material continuity. Ammunition allotments and weapon maintenance depended on timely paperwork. Delays risked disciplinary notes. Conversely, stations that met reporting deadlines and produced steady returns could argue for more bicycles, additional clerks, or repairs to telephones, creating incentives aligned with German priorities. Underground logistics, safe apartments, stencil duplicators, and paper avoided station capture by distributing functions. But this dispersion slowed decision cycles when quick warnings were needed. By late 1940 and into 1941, the strategic picture solidified. German planners aimed for predictable routines, quantitative oversight, and local intermediaries to anchor an economy of force. The underground aimed to preserve capacity, gather granular knowledge of those routines, and identify points where individual discretion could mitigate risk to civilians without triggering reprisals. Both sets of plans assumed a controllable environment. Neither fully incorporated the shocks that would come with mass resettlements, intensified labor demands, and the spread of armed resistance. Those later developments would test whether a police force built for paperwork, patrols, and escorts could be repurposed for escalatory tasks, and whether networks premised on quiet accommodations could absorb the pressure without collapse. Early confrontations took the form of structured operations rather than pitched battles. In the first half of 1940, city commands in Warsaw, Lodz, Krakow, Radom, and Lublin scheduled cordon and search actions to implement identification, housing, and market decrees. Mixed detachments assembled at dawn at precinct yards. A German NCO briefed the route, blue police squads received building lists, and municipal clerks carried forms. The typical pattern was a perimeter of German Schutzpolizei, or gendarmerie, with blue police teams entering stairwells, checking documents, and directing residents to queues for verification. Arrest authority remained German. Local officers completed initial screening, wrote names, and escorted selected individuals to trucks. In Lodz, where ghettoization advanced in early 1940, and sealing followed by the end of April, posts at gates were staffed according to fixed rosters that paired German sentries with blue police outside the perimeter. Jewish order service units handled internal lines. In Warsaw, where ghetto boundaries and gate locations were formalized by October-November 1940, similar outside-inside divisions of labor took shape, with local patrols conducting pass checks on adjacent streets and regulating queues for work details. Railway hubs saw the earliest frictions. Freight inspectors reported losses from pilfered coal and foodstuffs. In response, German railway police requested night patrols along sidings and yard entrances. Blue police detachments, equipped with carbines and lanterns, walked fixed beats between sheds and fences. Encounters ranged from routine document checks to brief chases. Arrests were often for lack of papers or possession of untaxed goods rather than armed resistance. Yet even these minor cases had wider effects. Confiscations and short detentions fed market scarcity and household risk calculations, while station rosters learned which sidings yielded seizures. Underground observers treated these patrols as barometers of German priorities and mapped routes accordingly. Traffic and market enforcement produced another series of first engagements. As rationing tightened, city halls posted price ceilings and transport vouchers. Patrols inspected handcarts and stalls, weighed meat, and compared tallies to ration conversions. On market days, larger mixed teams occupied corners of squares, stopping carriers and checking vouchers. Disputes were common. Traders cited family needs or workplace exemptions. Patrol leaders cited ordinance numbers. When disagreements escalated, German supervisors intervened and made custody decisions. The blue police role remained procedural, recording, escorting, collecting signatures, while households experienced the encounter as the point where an abstract decree turned into loss of goods or movement limits. Ghetto gate routines brought the earliest sustained contact between uniformed patrols and Jewish residents under movement restrictions. Morning and evening peaks saw escorts of registered laborers to workshops and factories. Outside posts handled street crowding, deterred unauthorized passage, and transferred detainees to German custody. Individual behavior varied within these structures. Underground bulletins documented instances in which local officers extended a few minutes' grace to late returnees or directed passers-by to side alleys when supervisors approached. German files recorded disciplinary notes for negligent gate service, alongside commendations for punctual escorts. These small-time choices did not change policy, but shaped neighborhood memory of uniforms and produced the first lists of names categorized as strict, neutral, or lenient. The first violent incidents were sporadic and local. Curfew evasion sometimes ended with warning shots or wounding when a runner turned a corner into a patrol. Burglaries confronted by mixed teams occasionally escalated when suspects resisted or crowds gathered. In rural districts, grain inspection parties met stone throwing or dispersal attempts. Most ended with arrests and referrals, some with injuries. The pattern was not continuous combat, but a series of brief, bounded confrontations where initiative rested with German commanders and legal form with the local escorts. Casualty tables from this period remained low compared to later phases, but each case entered both German statistics and underground chronicles, shaping perceptions of risk. Underground organizations tested the edges of the system without direct attacks on stations. Couriers adjusted routes to avoid predictable checkpoints. Safe apartments shifted when station habits changed. Intelligence sections gathered copies of printed orders and summarized them in clandestine circulars to standardize civilian responses. Carry papers. Avoid carrying more than permitted weights. Learn patrol hours, and prepare explanations that matched ordinance clauses. In parallel, they noted which precincts completed paperwork with unusual precision and which delayed referrals. The immediate goal was preserving mobility and information flow rather than confrontation. German planning responded to these early frictions with more detailed metrics. County chiefs circulated templates that counted not only arrests and seizures, but also controls per man-hour and escorts delivered on schedule. Telephones connected precincts to district headquarters. Outage logs prompted installation of additional lines in some cities. Blue police commanders compiled beat maps with time blocks to concentrate effort where returns had been highest. Predictability increased, so did civilian adaptation. Market traders shifted to side streets. Commuters learned to stagger departure times. Families consolidated ration cards to reduce exposure to repeated inspections. Contacts with other auxiliaries clarified functional borders. Railway guards called blue police when suspect goods left the station precinct. Municipal guards transferred minor offenders to stations for entry into German forms. Ghetto internal units referred pass violations to outside posts, but did not accompany detainees beyond gates. These delineations minimized duplication, but created seams. Smugglers exploited the gaps between jurisdictions. Households timed movements for shift changes. Underground couriers used transitions between inside and outside posts to pass messages. A subset of local officers began quietly supplying low-grade information to neighborhood committees or underground contacts. Notice of a planned address census, hints about an inspection focus, or confirmation that a supervisor would be absent from a shift. The motives varied: personal ties, calculation that minor warnings reduced neighborhood tension, or a belief that forewarning would avoid panic and crowding that complicated patrol work. German supervision remained attentive to fraternization. Disciplinary actions for excessive conversation with civilians appear in station notes. The effect on operations was marginal in statistical terms, but significant for those immediately affected, laying the groundwork for later, more deliberate information flows. By mid-1941, the portfolio of engagements was established. Street checks, market inspections, gate duties, and railway patrols produced constant, low-intensity contact between uniformed men and civilians. Decisions about arrest and interrogation stayed with German officers. Local patrols handled approach, identity verification, and escort. The underground preserved networks, cataloged names and habits, and refrained from premature attacks that would trigger reprisals. Civilians navigated rules and routines with increasing skill. These accumulated interactions, brief, measured, and recorded, set the template by which the system would confront sharper policies, mass deportations, and the emergence of armed resistance after the summer of 1941. Escalation followed the German invasion of the USSR on 22 June 1941. The general government expanded eastward with the creation of the District Galicia in August 1941, bringing new urban centers and mixed rural zones under the same policing framework. German priorities shifted to securing rear areas for supply lines to the Eastern Front, increasing labor deliveries, and tightening controls over Jewish communities. Ordinances hardened, capital penalties for unauthorized weapons, sheltering fugitives, and aiding those outside assigned districts were reiterated in circulars to all stations. Patrol density increased near rail nodes feeding eastbound traffic. County chiefs requested larger complements for harvest inspections and winter fuel checks. citing shortages and theft reports. Aggregate strength of the Blue Police rose toward 14,000 to 16,000 by late 1942 as training cohorts graduated and posts were added in newly absorbed districts, while German formations concentrated on mobile operations, intelligence, and large-scale actions. Material conditions deteriorated through 1941 to 1942. The winter of 1941 to 1942 strained food and fuel, magnifying black market activity and forcing more frequent inspections. Police duty logs show longer shifts for market days, reinforced night patrols around depots, and additional checkpoints on roads linking towns to villages. Ammunition allocations remained limited. Some stations documented shortages that constrained response to armed incidents. Communications still relied on telephones subject to outages. Runners bridged gaps during storms or power cuts, slowing decision cycles. As labor quotas rose, patrols assisted German details in assembling work contingents at squares or factory gates. Some stations were tasked with inventorying apartments for over-occupancy, producing lists later used by German authorities to reassign rooms or to identify lodgers without permits. Anti-Jewish policy moved from restrictions to mass deportations in 1942. Ghettos sealed in 1940 to 1941 became staging points. In Warsaw, between July and September 1942, approximately 254,000 to 300,000 people were deported by rail. In Krakow and Radom districts, transports proceeded on staggered calendars into autumn. Operational design placed German security units at the core of planning and command. The Blue Police appeared in the outer layers, cordons on adjacent streets, directing flows to assembly points, escorting columns to transfer sites, and guarding perimeters while German supervisors conducted selections inside courtyards or at platforms. Inside ghetto boundaries, Jewish order service units handled internal queues. Outside, mixed German local teams maintained the approaches. Individual behavior within these structures varied. Some officers executed orders with procedural precision. Others slowed paperwork, looked away at side gates, or passed advance notice of a sweep to neighborhood contacts. German disciplinary files recorded both commendations for punctual delivery of escorts and punishments for negligent performance or absence from assigned post. Violence increased unevenly across regions. In forested counties by rail corridors feeding the Eastern Front, reports of armed bands rose in late 1942. These groups ranged from early Soviet partisan detachments to emerging Polish formations and local self-defense units. German responses combined military sweeps with police-led searches. Blue Police stations received orders to provide guides and outer cordons. Ammunition issues and limited training in small unit tactics constrained their role in direct engagements. Casualties in these actions were counted in police returns and underground chronicles, with discrepancies in attribution. In some counties, patrols suffered ambushes on predictable routes. Commanders responded by altering beats and pairing more officers on night shifts. In others, the main risk remained crowd dynamics during labor assemblies or property disputes during apartment inspections. The underground expanded in parallel. In 1942, the Home Army consolidated command and began selective armed operations, while preserving intelligence channels inside administrative offices and, in rare cases, police stations. Underground instructions emphasized caution. Avoid direct confrontation where reprisals were expected, use knowledge of patrol rhythms, and prioritize survival of networks. Yet, targeted actions did occur. Courier rescues from escort lines, document forgeries, and occasional disarming of isolated patrols. German countermeasures included collective responsibility notices, curfew tightening, and proportionate ratios for reprisals after attacks on uniformed personnel. Stations received circulars reminding them to report any sign of contact with clandestine groups. Interrogations and transfers to German custody followed when suspicion attached to an individual officer. District Galicia presented distinct features. Local auxiliary police units, often labeled Schutzmannschaft battalions under German command, operated alongside or instead of blue police in certain towns, reflecting different pre-war administrative legacies and demographic composition. Functional boundaries overlapped. Some posts handled traffic and market policing. Others were tasked with anti-partisan patrols or village searches. The presence of multiple auxiliaries complicated public perception and underground assessments. Lists of strict, neutral, or lenient names multiplied, and attributions of actions became less clear when several uniforms appeared at the same operation. German files, for their part, emphasized outputs, numbers of detainees, escorts delivered, weapons seized, rather than fine-grained distinctions among local detachments. Economic pressures sustained a baseline of daily confrontation. Requisition quotas for grain and livestock in 1942 triggered tighter rural inspections and penalties for unauthorized slaughter. Town households faced fuel checks before winter, with seizures recorded in kilograms and cubic meters. Smuggling routes adapted, moving through cemetery paths, riverbanks, and rail embankments. Patrols responded with more frequent searches and identity checks. But predictability still allowed traders to avoid the densest inspection points. The administrative emphasis on returns, controls per man-hour, seizures per shift, pushed stations to concentrate where statistics could be met, leaving seams elsewhere that illicit traffic exploited. Morale and discipline diverged across posts. Some officers sought transfers to quieter districts or administrative roles. Others requested leave extensions citing family obligations. Desertions occurred, though at rates difficult to quantify given overlapping categories of absence, illness, and unauthorized leave. The underground recorded defections that resulted in new informants or, in fewer cases, armed recruits. German superiors tightened oversight, introduced surprise inspections, and rotated personnel to reduce local ties. The cumulative effect was a cycle of control and adjustment rather than a decisive stabilization. Civilians interpreted the system through immediate outcomes. Whether a house search concluded without arrests, whether a queue dispersed without blows, whether a rumor of a sweep matched the actual street chosen at dawn. International attention touched the region indirectly. The Polish government in exile reported on deportations and reprisals to Allied audiences, while German propaganda framed order maintenance as protection against crime and sabotage. Neither narrative altered the local mechanics. By late 1942, the crisis phase was marked by simultaneous intensification, mass deportations from ghettos on fixed timetables, increased demands for labor and food, rising activity of armed groups in selected counties, and stricter reprisals after attacks. Within this environment, the Blue Police continued to function as outer cordon, street presence, and escort service under German command, while individual choices, warning a neighbor, delaying a list, or following an order precisely, continued to accumulate in neighborhood memory and underground ledgers. The structure held, but strain was visible in longer rosters, sharper decrees, and the growing unpredictability of what a routine patrol might encounter after nightfall. The peak phase unfolded between mid-1942 and late 1943, when large-scale operations converged. Mass deportations from ghettos, intensified anti-partisan sweeps along rail corridors to the Eastern Front, and resettlement actions in selected rural districts. Command decisions elevated tempo and coordination. In the general government, Governor-General Hans Frank continued civil administration, while the higher SS and police leader position passed from Friedrich Wilhelm Kruger to Wilhelm Koppe in late 1943. After months of disputes over methods and manpower, county police chiefs received denser calendars of actions with fixed quotas and hourly timetables. German security formations, Schutzpolizei, Gendarmerie, security police, and Waffen-SS detachments planned the core arrests and transfers. The Blue Police were assigned cordons, crowd control, and escorts, with detailed rosters that synchronized gateposts, street intersections, and rail approaches. The largest operations centered on the liquidation of ghettos and deportations to killing sites and labor camps. In Warsaw, between July and September 1942, Approximately 254,000 to 300,000 people were sent in transports to Treblinka in actions that used layered perimeters and assembly points near Umschlagplatz. In Krakow and Radom districts, deportations proceeded over staggered weeks through 1942 and early 1943. In Lublin district, the Majdanek camp became a destination as well as a labor and transit node. During these operations, German units conducted selections inside courtyards and buildings. Blue police teams delivered outer control, directed flows, and escorted columns to transfer sites. Duty logs show standardized forms for counting persons handed over, timing of deliveries, and returns of equipment, variations in individual behavior, warnings, delays in paperwork, strict adherence to lists, continued but did not alter command design. Urban fighting in 1943 marked the upper limit of police involvement. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began on the 19th of April, 1943, and ended by mid-May with the destruction of the Great Synagogue on the 16th of May. German Commander Jürgen Stroop's daily reports recorded forces numbering in the low thousands drawn from SS, police, and auxiliaries, with operational losses he summarized as 16 killed and 85 wounded, and with 56,065 persons captured, including categories of fighters and civilians. Jewish fighting organizations fielded several hundred armed participants with pistols, rifles, grenades, and improvised explosives. Blue police duty during the uprising concentrated on outside streets, diversion of traffic, and custody transfers of detainees delivered from the perimeter to German stations. After the ghetto's destruction, patrols were tasked with preventing re-entry into ruins and reporting salvage thefts. The action's parameters, German command, layered perimeters, and defined roles for auxiliaries were replicated at smaller scale in liquidations in Krakow in March 1943 and in towns across Radom and Lublin districts. Anti-partisan operations escalated in forest belts and along main rail lines supplying the Eastern Front. Reports from summer and autumn 1943 describe mixed columns moving at dawn to encircle villages near suspected camps or sabotage sites. German units conducted searches and interrogations. Blue police formed outer rings, guided columns along local paths, and manned roadblocks on approaches to towns. Firefights occurred when small detachments encountered ambushes. Training and ammunition constraints limited the local patrol's role in prolonged engagements. Casualty numbers were recorded in separate ledgers. German summaries listed weapons seized and detainees transferred. Underground chronicles listed dead and missing by name and village. Sabotage of rails and telegraph lines rose in 1943. Patrols responded with fixed posts at bridges and culverts and with night sweeps along embankments. Predictable patrol rhythms encouraged partisans to time actions between shift changes. Commanders adjusted by compressing beats and pairing more men after dusk. Resettlement operations in the Zamość region showed how demographic policy intersected with policing. Beginning in late 1942 and continuing into 1943, German authorities removed an estimated 110,000 people from selected counties to make room for planned settlements. Actions followed a repeated pattern: encirclement at night, public square assembly at dawn, selection, and transport. Blue police were assigned to street corners and approaches to escort carts and to deliver detainees to transfer points. Records show entries of households processed and goods inventoried, while German reports recorded train departures and destination camps. Resistance grew over months, with armed encounters increasing near forests and with escapes during column movements. The combination of quotas, fixed schedules, and predictable perimeters created both bureaucratic certainty for planners and tactical openings for opponents. Civilian conditions at the peak reflected the weight of these operations. Rationing tightened. Coal and wood inspections increased before the winter of 1942 to 1943, and again in late 1943. Markets operated under closer supervision, with seizures logged in kilograms and liters, and with offenders referred to German courts. Labor roundups were reorganized into factory-linked quotas. Patrols managed queues and escorted groups from squares to railheads. Apartment inspections identified lodgers without papers. Stations compiled lists turned over to German housing offices, which reassigned rooms or ordered removals. Households responded with strategies measured in hours, shifting routes to work, consolidating ration cards at fewer addresses, hiding goods in floors and courtyards, and learning patrol sequences on main streets. High command choices sought to stabilize outputs with fewer German personnel by leveraging local intermediaries. Rotations moved officers across counties to reduce local ties. Surprise inspections checked reporting accuracy. Performance tables ranked stations by controls per man-hour and escorts delivered on schedule. The underground countered by expanding documentation networks, obtaining copies of circulars, and refining courier routes that avoided fixed checkpoints. Selective armed actions increased: rail sabotage, brief attacks on isolated posts, and targeted assassinations of identified informers or officers judged most active in roundups. German countermeasures applied ratio-based reprisals after attacks on uniformed personnel and issued posters warning of penalties for aiding partisans or fugitives. The Blue Police stood at the hinge of these measures, recording detentions and transfers while being monitored for signs of contact with clandestine groups. Losses and gains were assessed in administrative rather than tactical terms. German offices reported trains dispatched, tons of seized goods, and hours of patrols. Underground reports counted successful evasions, rescued couriers, and sabotage results measured in delays and repairs. Civilian suffering was registered in displacement figures, confiscation totals, and lists of detained relatives. The concentration of operations in 1942 to 1943 produced the highest tempo of cordons, escorts, and patrol hours for local stations. With front lines far to the east through much of 1943, the occupation's peak intensity in the general government took the form of planned schedules rather than continuous battles. Within those schedules, individual decisions at posts and desks continued to shape immediate outcomes while leaving the strategic structure unchanged. Resistance and adaptation developed as a set of incremental techniques rather than a single shift. By late 1943, the underground expanded beyond intelligence and courier work to include selective armed actions, document production, and systematic preparation for a national rising. In cities, clandestine print shops produced counterfeit kin carton, work certificates, and rail passes. Workshops assembled Sten and Błyskawice, patterned submachine guns from locally machined parts and smuggled components. Railway sabotage took the form of short disruptions, loosening fish plates, cutting telegraph wires, or placing small charges at culverts, time between patrol shifts. These actions aimed to delay trains carrying troops or requisitioned goods, rather than to contest territory. The Home Army's counterintelligence units, operating under central instructions, targeted identified informers and selected security personnel for removal. Decisions on targets passed through layered approvals to manage reprisals risk. Operations were often brief, using pistols at close range and pre-planned withdrawal routes. Local police posts adjusted to the changing environment without a single template. Some stations increased patrol size after dusk, paired senior and junior officers, and shortened beat lengths near rail lines and depots. Others emphasized paperwork precision, time-stamped reports, duplicate lists, and immediate handover of detainees to German custody to reduce discretionary exposure. German supervision introduced surprise inspections, rotated personnel across counties, and reassigned men identified as having deep local ties. Training blocks added short counter-sabotage modules, recognizing tampered bolts, reading patterns and repeated market seizures, and basic convoy protection for escorting work details. Ammunition remained rationed. Where patrols expected contact, commanders borrowed carbines from storage and logged temporary issues. The underground's adaptive measures relied on mapping routines. Couriers tracked which intersections drew the most checks on specific days. Households shared information about which municipal offices demanded additional forms. Safe apartments moved along tram lines with multiple exits. Messages shifted from handwritten notes to memorized lists to reduce risk at searches. Contacts inside offices and, in select cases, Stations provided advance notice of planned address censuses or labor assemblies. These warnings were measured in minutes or hours rather than days, yet even marginal lead time allowed couriers to divert or families to consolidate papers. On the rail network, sabotage teams scouted for blind spots between the end of one patrol's beat and the start of the next, then used small charges or toolkits to produce delays sufficient to misalign timetables for a day. Rural zones developed parallel adaptations. Forest edge villages created lookouts on church towers or haystacks to note unusual night movements. When resettlement or search columns appeared, paths to woods were marked by cut twigs or moved fences. Smuggling routes shifted to riverbanks and cemetery boundaries. Farmers arranged decoy loads, legal quantities of grain or wood on top of carts, illicit sacks hidden beneath false floors. Police patrols responded with probing methods, tapping cart beds, using rods at gate checks, and comparing voucher serials to lists. As counters evolved, so did patrol tactics. Surprise roadblocks appeared at bends near bridges, and mixed teams checked both carts and pedestrian paths at the same time to stop displacement. Quiet sabotage inside administrative routines continued. Clerks misplaced files, wrote addresses with minor errors, or stamped forms with obsolete dates that required refiling. At stations, a desk sergeant might misread a house number that sent a patrol to the wrong stairwell, or assign a less diligent pair to a non-priority inspection. These acts were hard to detect and easy to explain as ordinary error. German offices, tracking outputs rather than process, saw fluctuations in seizure totals and arrest timing without always identifying causes. Where suspicion fell on a specific person, transfers or arrests followed. A few cases resulted in the court proceedings before German authorities. The underground cataloged such behavior as mitigating rather than resistance, reserving that term for deliberate acts with planned effect. Resource management shaped both sides. The underground standardized courier bags, established caches of medical supplies, and set rules for weapon use to conserve ammunition. After action, teams left no casings. Damaged tools were repaired in safe workshops with spare screws and springs. Police posts rationed fuel for bicycles, requested boot repairs ahead of winter, and staggered leave to maintain minimum coverage. Telephones remained the critical link. Outages forced reliance on runners, extending response times. Some stations experimented with message slips carried by tram conductors to district offices, a practice that improved speed but exposed patterns once the underground noticed conductors repeatedly entering precinct yards. The psychological toll manifested in absences, transfers, and changing behavior. Police records show requests for reassignment to administrative desks, citing family obligations or health. Underground lists note officers who became stricter after colleagues were attacked, and others who grew more cautious after witnessing reprisals. Civilians adjusted expectations by neighborhood. Where patrols were punctual and predictable, residents calibrated movement and carried precise documents. Where behavior fluctuated, anxiety increased and rumors multiplied. Underground bulletins advised avoiding confrontations, using neutral language during checks, and preparing duplicate packets of papers to hand over if the first bundle was confiscated. Innovation appeared at small scales. In cities, underground guides developed shadow routes that paralleled main streets but avoided fixed checkpoints, using courtyards and linked stairwells. On railways, saboteurs exploited the gap between station lighting and yard darkness by placing devices on lightly watched sidings feeding the main line. Police adapted with lantern patrols and occasional use of dogs at bridges. Saboteurs answered by shifting to signaling wire cuts, requiring slower detection. In ghetto-adjacent districts, clandestine medical teams prepared kits for those attempting to cross to the Aryan side. Patrols responded with increased attention to clothing dyes, footwear, and hand calluses that betrayed recent labor. Each technique generated a counter-technique, with gains measured in days or in the avoidance of one arrest rather than in decisive shifts. Morale within armed underground units fluctuated with results. Successful courier rescues and clean withdrawals after brief attacks raised confidence and recruitment. Failed attempts, arrests at checkpoints, or reprisals reduced operational tempo in affected quarters. Police morale tracked differently, tied to pay regularity, rations, and the perceived fairness of German oversight. Surprise inspections that produced collective punishment for a station eroded cohesion. Clear performance tables and predictable rewards for punctual escorts improved compliance. German supervisors tried to keep local forces at a functional equilibrium, present enough to deliver statistics, constrained enough to avoid independent initiative that might complicate operations. By early 1944, both systems exhibited learned behavior. The underground avoided predictable hours and routes, moved from paper to memory where possible, and limited armed actions to cases with planned withdrawal corridors. Police posts compressed beats, used paired patrols near rail and bridge targets, and minimized discretionary stops that created crowds. The result was not stalemate, but a steady, low-grade contest of adjustments. Each side sought to preserve scarce resources, ammunition, trustworthy personnel, reliable information, while meeting external demands, German quotas for labor, grain, and detainees, underground requirements for intelligence, safe mobility, and selective strikes. In this environment, the line between survival, collaboration, and quiet sabotage remained granular and situational, expressed in small choices at doors, gates, and desks, rather than in proclamations. The turning point unfolded between summer 1944 and early 1945 as the front approached from the east, and German authority and the general government lost coherence. Operation Bagration, launched on 22 June 1944, broke Army Group Center and pushed German logistics into crisis. Rail corridors through Brest, Lublin, and Warsaw became evacuation routes. Police resources were diverted to guard depots, escorts for retreating offices, and demolition details at bridges and warehouses designated for destruction. County chiefs received conflicting orders: maintain curfews and labor quotas, secure archives for transfer, and prepare for rapid withdrawal. In practice, patrols shortened beats, concentrated near junctions, and shifted from market inspections to guarding convoys and ammunition dumps. The Blue Police, already stretched by rotations, ammunition rationing, and surprise inspections, found their routines disrupted by requisitions of bicycles and radios for German units and by the disappearance of German supervisors redeployed to field formations. Administrative structures changed as political authorities reorganized. In July 1944, the Soviet advance brought the formation of a new Polish administration in Lublin, which began assembling a citizens' militia under its authority. The underground civil structures, State Security Corps linked to the Home Army, also prepared to surface where possible. This duality produced divergent instructions for men in blue police posts as frontline noise intensified. Some underground channels signaled selected officers to stand down at a critical hour, to protect archives useful for post-war identification of property and deaths, or to safeguard hospitals and waterworks. New authorities in waiting prepared lists of candidates for future service and lists for arrest. German files from the same period show orders to destroy sensitive papers, transfer selected prisoners west, and disarm local auxiliaries deemed unreliable. The same station could receive a German order to supply guards for a demolition crew, and, hours later, an underground message advising the desk sergeant to vacate the post before dawn. The Warsaw Uprising on August 1, 1944, concentrated these tensions. For 63 days, the city became a battlefield with German forces, SS, police, and ad hoc battle groups, fighting Home Army units organized into districts. The role of the Blue Police during the uprising contracted sharply. Many posts in contested quarters were overrun or abandoned in the opening days. Others were disarmed by German units consolidating their rear. Where precincts remained under German control, local officers were used for custody transfers and perimeter duties behind German lines. Elsewhere, individual policemen shifted into civilian clothes, sought to avoid forced labor detachments, or attempted to reach relatives across barricades. The municipal infrastructure, water stations, tram depots, hospitals, became targets of competing claims. Surviving minutes from city offices record frantic requests for guards to prevent looting or to manage crowds during evacuations, with assignments filled by whatever uniformed personnel remained accessible. The uprising ended on October 2, 1944, with capitulation terms for combatants and the expulsion of civilians from the city. Police functions in the ruins were handled by German formations and brought in auxiliaries as Warsaw was systematically cleared and burned. Outside Warsaw, turning points appeared in provincial towns at different tempos. In Lublin, Soviet entry in late July 1944 ended German policing abruptly. New authorities assembled provisional patrols from underground personnel and recruits, some of whom had previously served in local posts. In Kielce, Radom, and Krakow districts, German command persisted longer, but patterns shifted. Checkpoints prioritized westbound traffic and military trains. Apartment inspections gave way to requisitions of carts and horses. Curfew notices multiplied even as patrols thinned. Village searches continued along forest belts where armed groups increased in size and coordination. Encounters between patrols and partisans became more frequent, but the character of police involvement remained similar. Outer cordons, guides for German columns, and roadblocks. The key difference was uncertainty. Patrols could return to find their station reassigned, their telephone cut, or an order under a new letterhead replacing the previous one. Individual decisions now carried amplified consequences. Some officers left posts during the confusion, removing insignia and seeking anonymity. Underground ledgers recorded select defections to armed units, usually after vetting and often assigned to non-frontline tasks. Others attempted to maintain minimal order, protecting warehouses from opportunistic theft, or escorting municipal clerks during food distributions, arguing that collapse would mean uncontrolled violence. German oversight responded unevenly. In some counties, disarmament orders for local auxiliaries were enforced rigorously, with arrests and transfers west. In others, the shortage of personnel led German commanders to retain posts on short leashes, threatening collective punishment for any sign of defection. The result was a patchwork of outcomes: quiet withdrawals, abrupt arrests, and negotiated handovers of keys and files when the first units of a new authority appeared. For Jewish survivors in hiding, the turning point brought both opportunity and risk. With deportation machinery largely dismantled after 1943 and with German evacuations underway, some previously sealed spaces opened. Movement in the confusion created chances to relocate or to emerge. At the same time, intensified searches for deserters and partisans increased street checks in some quarters, and retreat columns brought transient units unfamiliar with local arrangements. Local patrols, when still operating, confronted dilemmas familiar from earlier phases in compressed time, whether to insist on papers from a passerby with an implausible story, whether to look away amid a stream of westbound carts, whether to prioritize guarding a water pump over screening a line for labor. Actions remained small in scale, but carried higher stakes with institutions collapsing around them. On the underground side, the turning point meant transitioning from preservation to selective assertion of control. Instructions prioritized securing archives of civil status, property registries, and demographic records, guarding power stations and waterworks, and preventing reprisals during the interregnum between German withdrawal and the arrival of a new administration. Where Soviet forces entered first, coordination was limited. NKVD and new Polish security organs set their own priorities, which included screening underground cadres. Former Blue Police personnel faced screening as well, with differing criteria. Underground justice lists considered conduct during deportations and roundups. New authorities asked for immediate utility and loyalty under post-war structures. Some men passed into the citizens' militia with fresh documents and a new chain of command. Others were detained pending investigation or disappeared west with retreating German units. Documentation from late 1944 into early 1945 exhibits the transitional nature of policing. Reports change headings, but retain tables familiar from earlier years: numbers of patrols, arrests, and escorts. What altered was purpose. Where German forms had counted seizures and deliveries to German courts, new forms recorded arrests of suspected collaborators, protection of factories designated for reconstruction, and seizures of weapons left by retreating units. The metrics persisted, the categories shifted. Neighborhood memory, however, did not reset with the forms. Names and episodes from 1942 to 1943 reappeared in petitions, denunciations, and requests for protection. The same stairwells, bridges, and market corners that had framed encounters under occupation now framed arguments about responsibility. By the end of 1944, the turning point had crystallized. The structure that had defined daily contact, German command, local patrol execution, statistical oversight, was dissolving. In its place, overlapping authorities sought to impose new hierarchies using some of the same buildings, many of the same streets, and, in part, some of the same people. For those who had worn the blue uniform, outcomes were contingent on locality, prior conduct, timing, and the identity of the first authority to arrive. For civilians, the practical questions remained constant: papers, queues, access to food and fuel. But the answers now depended on a rapidly changing set of seals and signatures. Combat operations in central Poland ended locally rather than by a single decree. Between January and May 1945, German formations withdrew or capitulated. Soviet fronts crossed the Vistula and Oder, and new Polish authorities under the provisional government extended institutions from liberated cities into smaller towns. Police posts that had functioned under German command either dissolved during evacuations, were disarmed by incoming forces, or were taken over intact and reflagged. Building keys, arrest registers, and seized property ledgers passed to the citizens' militia and security offices, often through ad hoc handovers witnessed by municipal clerks. In some towns, former Blue Police personnel remained in place for days to guard waterworks, warehouses, or medical depots until replacements arrived. In others, stations stood empty, doors broken, files scattered. The end of operations as a German-managed system did not end the routines of patrol, escort, and paperwork. It relocated them under new headings. Immediate consequences unfolded on several tracks. First came screening. New authorities established commissions at county seats to register former uniformed personnel, verify identity, and decide on provisional status, detention, release with reporting obligations, or conditional employment. Screening protocols asked about station assignments during 1942 to 1943 deportations, participation in cordons, and any contact with underground structures. Witness statements were gathered from neighbors, municipal clerks, and factory guards. In larger cities, underground archives were consulted where they had survived the fighting. Outcomes varied. Some men were accepted into the citizens' militia to fill urgent personnel gaps, typically after pledges and brief retraining. Others were detained pending investigation. A fraction disappeared west during the winter, either with retreating German columns or by individual flight. Legal proceedings followed as administrative capacity stabilized. Decrees issued in mid and late 1944 provided the framework for prosecuting crimes committed under occupation, defining categories such as participation in mass arrests, extortion under color of office, and collaboration that facilitated deportations. Special criminal courts heard cases with mixed panels. Evidentiary standards relied heavily on documents from station files, German circulars bearing signatures, and lists of escorts delivered to specified dates. Defense arguments generally emphasized limited authority, the requirement to deliver detainees to German custody without power to decide outcomes, and episodes of discreet mitigation, warnings, delayed paperwork, or failure to appear at a gatepost. Verdicts covered the full range: acquittals where testimony converged on attempts at relief, prison terms for patterns of participation in cordons and market seizures beyond routine quotas, and, in a subset, capital sentences in cases tied to lethal outcomes. Numbers differed by district and by availability of records. In counties where files survived intact, prosecutors pursued more cases, while elsewhere proceedings relied on fragmentary witness lists. Humanitarian crises structured daily life in parallel with legal processes. Cities like Warsaw lay in ruins, with water, heat, and transport restored only gradually. Displaced people moved in several streams: survivors from camps and forced labor, civilians returning from evacuation, and families from eastern voivodeships resettled westward under new borders. Queues for ration registration and housing allocations often formed in front of the same buildings that had processed papers during occupation. The citizens' militia assumed crowd control, guarded warehouses, and escorted convoys carrying flour and coal. In these tasks, procedural continuities were visible: standardized forms, patrol rosters, and statistical returns. What differed were categories: protection of returning transports rather than their assembly, arrest of looters rather than of curfew violators, custody of suspected collaborators rather than of undocumented travelers. Violence did not vanish with front lines. Armed incidents persisted into 1945 to 1946 as different formations operated in the countryside: remnants of German-led groups trying to avoid capture, Soviet military patrols, new Polish security detachments, and anti-communist underground units. Former Blue Police personnel figured in this landscape as defendants in courts, as recruits to new forces, or as targets in retaliatory actions by clandestine groups. Some faced attacks after public postings of names. Others received protection from municipal councils that cited their role in safeguarding utilities during the transition. The diversity of outcomes reflected local balances of memory, documentation, and immediate utility to authorities facing shortages of trained personnel. Administrative aftershocks extended to property and records. Station ledgers listing seized goods, tenant counts, and identity registers were repurposed to reconstruct ownership, issue provisional documents, and trace missing relatives. For Jewish survivors attempting to reclaim apartments or shops, these files were often the only official traces of pre-deportation addresses and inventory receipts. Conflicts arose when post-war allocations overlapped with pre-war titles. Municipal boards requested the same station records courts sought for criminal cases, forcing prioritization and sometimes loss when files were moved repeatedly. In rural districts, lists of carts and livestock seized during requisitions were used to adjudicate compensation claims. Their precision varied with earlier reporting habits. Repatriation traffic altered policing demands. Trains arrived with former forced laborers and evacuees. Convoys departed west from territories newly assigned to Poland under post-war agreements. Crowd control at stations, protection of registration points, and prevention of theft from baggage trains became daily tasks. The citizens' militia, reinforced by recruits from demobilized units and vetted former policemen, reported patrol hours and incidents in tables that resembled those of earlier years, but with different destination offices and seals. The same statistical logic, controls per man-hour, incidents per shift, guided staffing decisions. Yet, the social meaning had changed. Queues formed for ration books, work assignments, and housing, not for deportation lists. Escorts led to employment bureaus and hospitals, not to assembly squares. Memory entered administration through petitions and denunciations. Neighborhood committees sent letters certifying that a named individual had warned residents before searches or had eased an inspection. Others submitted lists alleging abuse during market seizures or participation in roundups. Courts, and in lesser matters, municipal boards, had to weigh conflicting testimonies. Where underground archives recorded earlier assessments, they influenced outcomes. Where fighting had destroyed files, decisions relied on oral statements and whatever fragments of documentation remained. This produced inconsistency across districts and over time. The same conduct judged mitigating in one town might be judged disqualifying in another, depending on who arrived first with a certificate or ledger. Withdrawal of the previous system left unresolved questions about rank-and-file discretion under coercive command. Investigators reconstructed chains of orders using German circulars and station returns. Who signed cordon assignments? Who controlled gate lists? Who decided escort timings? The Blue Police's structural position, as outer cordon and escort under German direction, shaped both accusations and defenses. Prosecutors emphasized repeated presence at key operations and signatures on transfer receipts. Defense counsel highlighted lack of decision authority regarding final destinations and occasional acts that reduced immediate harm. The documentary record allowed neither a single narrative nor a uniform outcome. It produced case-by-case judgments that mirrored the fragmented end of occupation. By late 1945, the practical aftermath consisted of 3 layers moving at different speeds: courts working through files and testimonies, administrative offices rebuilding services and reallocating space, and security forces stabilizing transport and markets. Former Blue Police personnel appeared across all 3, as defendants, as clerks or patrolmen in new uniforms, and as names in neighborhood memory. The gray zone of occupation did not vanish with surrender. It translated into post-war ambiguity in which the same street corner could hold, within a year, a cordon for a deportation, a queue for a ration book, and a witness line outside a courthouse. The withdrawal of German authority ended one hierarchy. It began a period in which responsibility was adjudicated through documents, routines were repurposed for reconstruction, and social trust was rebuilt unevenly across districts. The legacy of the Blue Police is a layered record of institutions, documents, and individual trajectories that continued to shape Polish public life long after 1945. At the structural level, the force illustrates how an occupier economized manpower by delegating routine tasks to local auxiliaries while retaining decision authority for arrests, interrogations, and deportations. Duty rosters, escort receipts, and monthly statistical returns preserved in county archives demonstrate a consistent portfolio across districts. Street patrols, identity checks, market enforcement, traffic control at rail approaches, perimeter duties during large operations, and custody transfers to German stations. Aggregate strengths rose from roughly 10,000 to 12,000 men in 1940 toward 14,000 to 16,000 by late 1942, reflecting expansion into new districts and the need to staff gates, cordons, and railheads on fixed schedules. These figures place the formation among the larger auxiliary police forces in occupied Europe, comparable in scale to some Schutzmannschaft groupings in the East, while differing in organization, jurisdiction, and armament. Comparative perspectives clarify both commonalities and distinctions. In the Baltic and Ukrainian territories, German authorities raised Schutzmannschaft battalions with mixed internal and field roles, including anti-partisan tasks and, in some areas, direct participation in mass shootings. In the general government, the Blue Police were embedded in a civilian policing framework under German command, with emphasis on urban order, paperwork, and escorts. Inside ghettos, Jewish order service units, varying by city, with estimates for Warsaw around 1,500 to 2,000 men at peak, handled internal queues and lists, while Blue Police posts stood outside gates and along approach streets. French formations under Vichy maintained public order under armistice constraints with separate legal bases and different political dynamics. These comparisons do not collapse cases into a single model. They situate the Blue Police within a spectrum of occupations where legal codes, command chains, and local social structures produce different mixes of routine policing and participation in state violence. Individual outcomes after 1945 diverged along administrative, legal, and social lines. Screening commissions registered former policemen, verified identities, and decided provisional status. Acceptance into the citizens' militia, release with reporting obligations, or detention pending investigation. Special criminal courts prosecuted occupation period offenses using decrees enacted in 1944 to 1945. Case files typically combine station paperwork, escort counts, signatures on transfer forms, lists of addresses visited during cordons, with witness statements from municipal clerks, neighbors, and underground cadres. Verdicts range from acquittals to prison terms and, in a smaller subset, capital sentences. The variation reflected locality, availability of archives, and the timing of institutional change. Districts with intact files processed more cases, while areas where records were lost depended on oral testimony and fragmentary documents. Quantitative methods applied to preserved ledgers have allowed historians to reconstruct patterns of activity. Tables of controls per man-hour, seizure weights, and escorts delivered reveal how statistical oversight shaped deployment. Correlations appear between market-day rosters and seizure totals, between rail node staffing and arrests for document irregularities, and between gate schedules and custody transfers. Microhistories at town scale, using house-by-house address cards and daily station logs, show how predictable beats produce civilian adaptation, shadow routes through courtyards, timing movements between shift changes, and how small discretionary acts affected outcomes. A miswritten apartment number that delayed a search, a 2-minute pause at a stairwell that allowed diversion, a strict list check that produced on-time delivery. These findings do not assign moral categories. They document mechanisms linking decrees, metrics, and street-level practice. Memory politics added further layers after 1989, as new archival access enabled re-examination of occupation institutions. The Institute of National Remembrance and regional archives published guides to German administrative records, police rosters, and court proceedings. Research highlighted both continuities, forms, seals, and statistical habits reused by post-war offices, and discontinuities, new categories, new supervising authorities, and new security priorities. Documentary films, museum exhibitions, and local commemorations integrated police stations into broader wartime narratives that also included ghettos, forced labor, partisans, and civilian survival strategies. Public debates often centered on the tension between structural position and individual agency. To what extent did the outer cordon role constitute participation when decision authority lay elsewhere? And how should mitigating acts be weighed against routine execution of orders? Scholarship addressed these questions by disaggregating tasks and time periods rather than treating the formation as a single, unchanging entity. The Blue Police also contributes to comparative studies of occupation law. German decrees in the general government created capital offenses for unauthorized weapons, sheltering fugitives, and aiding persons outside assigned districts, then required local auxiliaries to implement the first procedural steps: identity checks, detentions, and escorts. Legal historians trace how these decrees interacted with pre-war Polish codes, municipal regulations, and post-war prosecution frameworks. The paper trail, identity registers, confiscation receipts, gate pass logs, functioned as both operational tools during the war and evidentiary sources afterward. In property restitution and family tracing, station lists sometimes provided the only official link between a pre-deportation address and a surviving relative, illustrating how instruments of control became instruments of reconstruction. For studies of resistance, the formation's routines serve as the baseline against which adaptation is measured. Underground countermeasures, document production, courier mapping, small-scale rail sabotage, selective attacks emerged in dialogue with predictable patrols and metrics-driven deployments. Analyses of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and subsequent urban actions in 1943 to 1944 used police perimeter logs and transport timetables to understand how layered command worked under stress and how responsibilities shifted when fighting escalated beyond the capacity of local patrols. The same sources illuminate the interregnum of 1944 to 1945, when overlapping authorities issued conflicting orders and when precincts were disarmed, reflagged, or abandoned within days. The broader historical significance lies in the way the Blue Police crystallizes dilemmas common to occupied societies: the coexistence of routine order maintenance and coercive policies, the pressure of quotas and schedules on local behavior, the narrow space for discretionary action inside rigid hierarchies, and the persistence of bureaucratic forms across regime change. Its record resists reduction to a single label. It consists instead of dated rosters, beat maps, seizure tables, escort receipts, disciplinary notes, petitions, verdicts, and post-war personnel files that together chart how a force created for paperwork and patrol became a hinge between decrees and daily life, and how its members entered the post-war years as defendants, recruits, or anonymous civilians. The long-term effect on historical understanding is cumulative. Each recovered ledger and case file allows more precise reconstruction of how policies traveled from offices to streets, and how communities navigated a system that measured order in counts and schedules while leaving judgment to later courts and to the contested field of public memory.